May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. As a symbol of my Easter rejoicing, I am now always going to have tea in the pulpit during the Easter season. Once again, it is the Chinese tea, Lapsang Souchong Star. So Thomas offers us a very intense contradiction in himself. And what's wonderful about the contradiction is Thomas represents two sort of polarities of outsiders and outcasts in the church. It's sort of what's wonderful about this gospel immediately following Easter is if Easter is the gospel story for all those who, and it binds together all of us who have had in some way or another an encounter with God, Thomas represents two extremes that sort of orbit that sort of common link that we all have. The first is for those of us who maybe those of us who don't get it, those who don't fit because they don't see what the big deal is about Jesus. It could also be those of us who are going through a desert time from mountaintop to mountaintop, where for one reason or another we are waiting. We're waiting for God to do something, and God hasn't really done that much in our lives recently, and we don't quite get it. Or, I mean, there's all kinds of variations of this, but the sort of, it's for those of us who are searching and waiting for God to encounter us. The opposite extreme of that are those of us, is Thomas post-resurrection. And it's almost unfair what happens to poor Thomas, because most of us can be that pre-resurrection Thomas for our entire lives, right? We can say, well, I don't really get it. And I was like, no, he was here. I swear to God, he was right here. And he said, well, unless I put my hands literally in his side, I don't buy it, right? But then that actually happens. And this very rarely happens to us as Christians, where we go from, I don't know, I don't buy it, to lightning bolts, cloud descending, hand in the side, and suddenly Thomas has no choice to not just be faithful, but in a lot of ways to be a profound apostle, one of the first witnesses of the resurrected Jesus, one of the 12 most important figures of the church, and from that point on, he is compelled to preach the gospel through word and action throughout the world. And so tradition says, and this may not this is sort of a dubious claim for some historians, but it is exactly the kind of thing that God would do. Thomas is said to have founded the church in India. So poor Thomas goes from being an intellectual skeptic to being so convicted and impassioned that God says to him, okay, now that you love me, I want you to abandon all of your friends and all of your family and your beloved culture and move to India, where you will preach the gospel till the end of your days. And so there are those of us in our midst as well, those of us who were not just celebrating the Lord's resurrection last Sunday, but who have been called by God to a profound ministry, and their life is forever changed. And now they're on their way to their own version of India, where they will be outcasts and strangers to everyone they once knew, and weirdos and bizarre and accused of being crazy. They are also outcasts. This is who Thomas, I believe, is calling us. And I believe that at the end of the day, we inhabit each of these roles at different times in our lives. It is sometimes kind of frightening to discover how quickly we can shift from one to the next and back again. I once read a sermon by somebody saying that even if God had arranged all of the stars to say, God is, somehow over the course of the next few generations, we would utterly convince ourselves that it was some very strange and bizarre coincidence of the universe. No matter how God reaches us, we can very quickly, at some point in our lives, return to a very skeptical state. And at the same time, it seems like nothing brings God into our lives more profoundly and strangely than when we genuinely challenge God. The rabbis say one should rub the text until it bleeds. And there's something very powerful about inviting God in. I now do this with a great deal of trepidation because God called me to be a priest because I did just that. Don't taunt God. It's not a good idea. You might end up here one day. But what is wonderful about the term belief, there's something that we've gotten in our heads as we're a very rational culture, we're a very scientific culture, and there's a wonderful thing about that. But the writers of the Bible, when they talked about belief, it wasn't so intellectual, it wasn't so detached. When I say, we've separated the two words out. I say, I believe you, as in what you are saying is credible, and I can also say, I believe in you. Right? As I say, Lori, I believe in you. I believe you can be an Olympian, and you should go to the Olympics. I believe in you, right? It's a very different thing than if Lori said, I'm going to the Olympics tomorrow. I'd say, I don't know if I believe you, right? It's a very different style. And so what I love about the minimum request, and in a sense requirement that God has of compassionate people, is to believe in the church. There's not as much an emphasis on an intellectual, you should believe me, as in believe in the mission of the church, the mission of peace and love and hope. Believe in Christians. Believe that the world can be changed. Believe in the gospel message. Right? It's very different. Believe in us. Your mind can be your own, but you must at least believe in us as a church, that we are on the right path, that we're trying to change the world, that we're trying to change the world together as God worshipers. And when I was a child, there was that sense of, I don't know, I haven't had any kind of encounter with God, but I believe in my father, who is my priest. I believe in these wise people. I believe in the way that they live. I believe in the church. And I'm content to wait for something more profound to happen to me. That's sort of our fallback position as Christians, when we might wake up in the morning and be just in a crazy place. To say, well, at least I believe in the church. I believe in who I am as a Christian. I don't know what I think intellectually about anything. And God has given me the freedom to think whatever I think today. But I believe in the church. And I believe in God. That's kind of our fallback. And what ends up happening if we inhabit that place for long enough is that God will visit us. And sometimes it's wonderful and joyful and exciting. Sometimes it's terrifying. Most of the time, God wants us to do something. And we're wonderful as a church in mimicking that, where as soon as someone comes through our doors and says, I really love your church. Well, you know what? We have this job. We got this 4R sale. We got this altar guild that we're actually looking for members for. And it's wonderful that you love God. Now we need to get to work. Right? And unfortunately, that's exactly what God does. And if we try to fight it, there's all these wonderful stories in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, the best story is Jonah. Jonah, it's the comedy, right? It's the comedy in the Bible, right? Because Jonah receives this powerful call from God to be one of God's great prophets in the line of Isaiah and Jeremiah and all these great figures. And Jonah says, what do you want me to do? And he says, I want you to go to Nineveh to convert the city of Nineveh. And that's insane because Assyria was the most evil nation on the face of the earth. We have no nation currently like Assyria. It was basically demonic, right? It was really scary stuff. There was just open murder and violence and all the rest of it. Nineveh was its capital. It was also the great military power. So it's all the power of New York or Washington, but super evil. And God says, I want you to go there, and convert everybody. And so he gets on a boat and he sails to West Africa, the opposite end of the world. Because he's like, you're insane. I'll see you later, God. And of course, he gets eaten by a fish. And he's like, okay, fine, if this isn't working out. And then he turns around and ends up, and of course the comedy is he gets to Nineveh and they all convert. Right? Every last one of them. And he gets really angry at God and he sits under a tree and sulks. It's a great story. I recommend you all read Jonah. It's really bizarre and funny. But that's essentially the unfortunate fallback position for those of us who are like Thomas post-resurrection and have been called by God. Is the most we can do is basically get on a boat and sail for West Africa when we're called to go to India. And we'll get eaten by a fish at some point and get, one could argue in retrospect that my entire second degree after my seminary degree was a bit of an escape. It's like, God, how about we compromise and I'll just stay in grad school forever? And that lasted about 2 years, and then somehow I ended up here. So just be careful, But that's why Thomas is such a phenomenal. He's such a phenomenal, orbiter of all the rest of the apostles. For those of us who are content to spend some time believing in the project of the church and the future of this community. And for those of us who have jumped in the deep end and are on our way to our India, and we don't know where we're going to end up, and we're just in over our heads, Thomas is for us as well. Amen.